All right, so today we're going deep on a topic that you specifically requested, Helicobacter pylori.
Yeah,
It's a bacteria that, well, lives in your stomach lining.
right.
And you might be surprised to learn that it actually infects about half of
Wow.
the world's population.
That is a lot crazy.
It is. What's even more fascinating is that only like 20% of people who are infected even show any symptoms.
So we have a potential health concern for literally billions of people, but it kind of flies under the radar.
Yeah,
So this definitely seems like something worth exploring.
absolutely.
So where does this bacteria like to hang out geographically?
Well, it's more common in developing countries, but here in France, the data from the HHS shows that it affects about 15 to 30% of the population.
That's a big chunk of France.
It is.
Why developing countries, though? What is it about those environments that makes it so susceptible?
It really has a lot to do with transmission, how H. pylori spreads. So think person-to-person contact, especially when you're a kid, saliva, vomit, feces, those kinds of things.
So places that have crowded living conditions or, limited access to clean water and good sanitation, those are going to be more at risk.
So hygiene living conditions a big factor there.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about the symptoms. We know most people don't experience any, but for the people who do, what should they be looking out for?
Well, the most common are chronic gastritis, which is the inflammation of the stomach lining, and peptic ulcers.
Peptic ulcers, those are sores, right?
Yeah,
Like in your stomach.
exactly. They can form in the stomach or the duodenum, which is the first part of your small intestine.
Ouch. That does not sound fun.
No, it doesn't.
Is that the worst of it, though? Or does H. pylori have any other tricks up its sleeve?
Well, H. pylori is often harmless, but there can be some more serious complications.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, in about 1% of cases, it can lead to stomach cancer.
Oh, wow.
There are two main types that are linked to H. pylori adenocarcinoma, which is the most common, and then malt lymphoma, which is more rare.
Okay, so stomach cancer. Pretty scary thought.
Yeah.
So I'm sure our listener is now thinking, should I go get tested?
Well, not necessarily. Routine screening for H. pylori isn't actually recommended for everybody.
Okay, well, that's good.
Yeah.
So who should get tested?
Well, the H. pylori recommends testing if you have current or past ulcers,
Okay.
if you've been diagnosed with stomach cancer or you have a family history of it,
Family history being?
parents, siblings, children.
Okay.
Also, before bariatric surgery, you should be tested.
So there are a few situations, but not just everybody.
Right.
Let's say somebody falls into one of these categories and they need to get tested. How do you actually find this little bacteria? Like, what are the tests like?
There are a few different ways.
Okay.
One that's pretty common is the urea breath test.
The what?
Urea breath test.
What is that?
It involves you drinking a special liquid with urea in it, which is broken down by the bacteria.
Okay.
And if H. pylori is there, it'll release a gas, and you can detect it in your breath.
So they can sniff it out in your breath.
ACE.
Are there other tests?
There's a blood test that checks for antibodies to H. pylori. But that one can't tell the difference between a past infection and an active one.
Oh.
And then there's endoscopy, which is a little more invasive.
Endoscopy,
Yeah.
as in the camera down your throat?
Yeah. They basically stick this thin tube with a camera down your throat into your stomach so they can see the lining and take biopsies.
Yeah, I'm good with the breath test, I think.
Probably a little easier.
Okay, so let's say the tests come back positive. What's the treatment plan for H. pylori?
Well, the good news is that treatment is usually really effective. It has a 90% success rate.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. So typically it's a combination of antibiotics, proton pump inhibitors, which help produce stomach acid, and sometimes bismuth salts.
Interesting.
And the treatment usually lasts for 10 to 14 days.
Antibiotics, that makes sense.
Right.
But, with all the talk about antibiotic resistance these days, is that a concern with this?
It's a valid concern. Yeah, antibiotic resistance is a growing problem.
With H. pylori?
Yes.
What can you do?
Well, your doctor can order an antibiogram, which is basically a test to figure out which antibiotics will be most effective against your specific strain of bacteria.
So it's personalized.
Yeah.
They're not just throwing any old antibiotic at it.
Right.
But I imagine even with the right antibiotic, it's important to actually, follow the doctor's orders.
Absolutely. Sticking to the dosage and duration is really important for the treatment to work.
Okay. So let's say you've, been good, you've taken your medicine, you're feeling better. Is that the end of it?
Well, not quite. You need to have a follow-up test, usually the urea breath test again, just to make sure it's really gone. You don't want it coming back.
Yeah. You want to be sure. Any other advice? post-treatment.
Yeah, just be careful with certain medications, especially NSAIDs,
Like,
ibuprofen, aspirin, things like that,
okay.
because they can increase your risk of ulcers, especially if you've had H. pylori.
Okay, good to know. So we've talked about, the prevalence, the symptoms, the testing, the treatment. It all kind of begs the question, though, like, what does having H. pylori actually mean for your health?
Yeah, that's kind of a complex question.
Right.
Because for some people, they might have it and have no problems at all.
Really?
Yeah, but for others, it can lead to ulcers or increase the risk of cancer. So it's not really a one-size-fits-all situation.
So the impact can really vary from person to person.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to really understand the nuances of this bacteria and how it can potentially impact you.
Yeah, and that's what we're all about here, going beyond just the simple headlines and really diving into the
Mhm.
specifics. And that's where our exploration of H. pylori is going next.
Mhm.
We're going to unpack the real nitty-gritty of this bacteria and its relationship to our bodies.
It's fascinating stuff. We'll be talking about everything from, the disappearing microbiota hypothesis, yeah, to all the latest research on H. pylori and, how it could even be playing a role in our overall health.
Sounds like we're just getting started.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing how, our understanding of bacteria has really changed over time.
Yeah.
We used to think they were all bad, but now we're starting to realize that they're actually important for our health.
You're talking about the microbiome, right? All those bacteria that live inside of us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like this whole ecosystem of different bacteria.
It is kind of mind-blowing.
It is. And H. pylori is like a perfect example of that. I mean,
Yeah.
it was always seen as this bad guy.
Right, the ulcer guy.
Right. But now some research suggests that it might actually have some benefits too.
Wait, beneficial. The bacteria that can cause ulcers and cancer could be helpful. How does that even work?
Well, it's still being researched, but some studies show that H. pylori could play a role in regulating stomach acid.
Okay.
And that could help with things like, GERD or acid reflux.
So it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
It can be both good and bad.
Yeah. Right. And that's why it's really important to look at things from all sides, and not just assume that something is always bad just because it can cause harm.
That's what I love about these deep dives.
Yeah.
We get to uncover these details that we would never think about otherwise. Have you seen any research about the potential benefits of H. pylori?
Yeah, there's a lot of research going on about that right now. For example, some studies suggest that it might actually help protect against certain types of esophageal cancer.
Really? That's so weird, because we just said it can cause stomach cancer.
Yeah, it's complicated. Our bodies and bacteria interact in really complex ways.
It is really fascinating, and
Yeah.
it seems like our understanding of it is constantly changing. Speaking of evolving perspectives, one of the articles mentioned something called the disappearing microbiota hypothesis.
Oh, yeah.
What is that?
It's this really interesting idea that suggests, the decline of certain microbes like H. pylori in modern societies could actually be connected to the rise of some chronic diseases.
Okay, like what?
Well, some researchers think there's a connection between the reduced prevalence of H. pylori and an increase in things like allergies, asthma, and even autoimmune disorders.
So they're saying that getting rid of H. pylori might actually make us more susceptible to other health problems.
It's not a direct cause and effect thing. It's much more complicated than that. But, it does make you wonder if there might be unintended consequences when we mess with our microbial communities.
So instead of trying to just eliminate bacteria, maybe we need to focus on figuring out how to coexist with them.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance and realizing that, what might be considered harmful in one context could actually be beneficial in another.
We need to learn to dance with our microbes, not just fight them off.
I like that.
So what can people actually do to support a healthy and diverse gut microbiome?
Ooh, that's a question for a whole other deep dive.
Yeah, that's true.
But basically a diverse diet, lots of fiber fermented foods, prebiotics, those are all important.
Okay.
And of course, avoiding unnecessary antibiotics is always a good idea.
Yeah.
True. I know I could definitely use more fiber.
Yeah, me too. But anyway, back to H. pylori. I think it's important to remember that while it can be a problem, it's not something to panic about.
Right.
Knowledge is power, but it's also about, understanding the context.
Well said. Are there any breakthroughs or exciting new developments in the research?
Oh, there's always something new happening in science, right? And H. pylori research is definitely no exception.
Okay, so what's new?
Well, one area that's really interesting is the development of new diagnostic tools.
Like what?
Like, researchers are working on non-invasive tests that can detect it more accurately and easier. This would be a huge step forward, especially for kids or people who can't have an endoscopy.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Yeah, easier testing could mean earlier detection and treatment and, maybe prevent some of those complications down the road.
Right. Anything else that looks promising?
Um, well, there's also a lot of research going on about finding alternative treatments.
Alternative to antibiotics.
Yeah, because of the whole antibiotic resistance issue.
Right.
So scientists are exploring other options like probiotics or special diets to target H. pylori.
It's kind of crazy to think that we've known about this bacteria for decades.
Yeah.
And we're still learning so much about it.
It really is. Science is a never-ending journey of discovery.
You mentioned that it spreads through saliva, especially during childhood.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking, maybe our listeners are wondering this too.
Okay, what is it?
Could it be spread through kissing? I mean, kissing does involve exchanging saliva.
That's a really interesting question. I'm sure a lot of people have wondered about that.
So can you get H. pylori from a kiss?
It is possible, but the risk is pretty low.
Okay, so it's not a total romance killer.
No, but why is the risk so low if it can spread through saliva?
Well, it's probably because the amount of bacteria that's exchanged during a kiss is much lower than, say, sharing utensils or, being around someone who's vomiting.
Right.
But still, it's probably best to avoid, swapping spit with someone who has an active infection.
Good advice.
Yeah, just to be safe.
So speaking of safety,
Ooh, I see where you're going with this.
let's talk about prevention. I mean, it's treatable, but it would be better to not get it in the first place, right?
Of course. But how do you prevent something that spreads through everyday things?
Yeah. I mean, it almost seems impossible.
Right. And that's why it's so important to talk about things like hygiene, public health, and how we manage infectious diseases in this globalized world.
It does feel kind of impossible. Like, how do you prevent something like that?
Well, it's not impossible. You don't have to live in a bubble or anything,
Right.
but good hygiene is super important, especially washing your hands and, being careful when you prepare food.
Right, the basics.
Yeah. Those things really make a difference.
Okay, but what about, those bigger societal factors like we were talking about before?
Yeah.
Crowded living conditions, not having clean water, that kind of thing. I mean, those aren't things that people can just change on their own.
Exactly. That's a really important point. And it kind of brings us back to that question we talked about before, about the implications for public health, especially in those developing countries.
It's not just about what individuals do. It's about changing systems.
It is. It's about addressing those underlying issues like poverty and sanitation and making sure people have access to health care. Those are all essential parts of preventing H. pylori from spreading.
And other diseases too, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. It's a multifaceted problem, so it needs a multifaceted approach.
Yeah, for sure. So it sounds like we need both individual action and bigger public health changes to really tackle this thing.
Right. It's got to be both. It's about what individuals do, but it's also about public health policies and, improving infrastructure and global cooperation.
Wow. We went deep today.
We did.
From the tiny bacteria to the big picture stuff.
Yeah. Hopefully our listener has a much better understanding of H. pylori now.
I mean, I think they probably know more about it than most people.
Probably. It's great that they were so curious about it. Made for a good conversation.
It did. So as always, we like to leave our listeners with something to think about. What would you say is the most surprising thing you learned about H. pylori during this deep dive?
That's a tough one. There was a lot of really interesting stuff. I think for me, the most surprising was that disappearing microbiota hypothesis.
Yeah, me too.
Like the idea that, getting rid of H. pylori could help prevent some diseases.
Right.
But it could also have unintended consequences.
Wow.
That was just a really powerful concept. It makes you think.
Yeah. We're only just starting to figure out how our bodies and all those microbes work together.
That's for sure. And I think it's a good reminder to be careful, when we try to change the microbiome. It's such a delicate balance.
It really is. Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up. So to our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Helicobacter pylori.
Yeah, it was fun.
We hope you learned something new and interesting, maybe even something that surprised you.
And as always, keep being curious and keep exploring. There's so much out there to discover.